The opulent plaza ballroom was a galaxy of glittering diamonds and predatory smiles. For Emily Scott, it was a foreign, hostile planet. She clutched her small, worn handbag like a shield, feeling the weight of 100 judgmental stares on her simple, off-the-rack dress. The bride was her oldest friend, a girl from her neighborhood who had married into this stratosphere of wealth, and she had insisted Emily come. But now, standing alone by a towering floral arrangement, Emily felt less like a guest and more like a sociological experiment gone wrong. Across the room, Dr. Henry Montgomery felt a different kind of entrapment. He was cornered by his own mother, a formidable matriarch in Chanel, who was gesturing animatedly toward an heiress with a vacant smile and a fortune in textiles. "She's perfect, Henry," his mother hissed under the cover of the string quartet. "Her family has been summering in the Hamptons for 5 generations. It's time you settled down with someone appropriate." Henry's jaw tightened. Since his disastrous divorce, his mother's matchmaking attempts had become increasingly aggressive. He felt like a prize stallion being paraded for auction. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any escape, and then they met hers. He saw a girl across the ballroom, looking just as trapped as he felt. She was beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way, with intelligent eyes that were currently filled with a fiery mix of humiliation and defiance. He watched as an arrogant man in a tuxedo, reeking of whiskey and entitlement, cornered her. "I don't believe we've met," the man slurred, looking Emily up and down as if she were an item on a menu. "You must be with the catering staff. Could you fetch me another scotch?" The insult was a public execution. Emily's face flushed, her knuckles white as she gripped her handbag. She was about to turn and flee, her pride in tatters, and in that instant, Henry saw his chance. It was a reckless, impulsive idea, born of his own desperation, and a sudden, inexplicable urge to rescue the girl with the defiant eyes. He excused himself from his mother with a curt nod, leaving her mid-sentence, and crossed the ballroom with the purposeful stride of a surgeon heading into an emergency. The crowd parted for him. He didn't stop until he was standing right beside Emily. He completely ignored the arrogant guest, his entire focus on her. He leaned in, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper that was for her ears only, a secret shared in a room full of strangers. "Pretend to be my wife." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. It was Dr. Henry Montgomery, the billionaire neurosurgeon, a man she had only ever seen in magazines. "What?" she breathed. "Play along," he murmured, his eyes glinting with a dangerous, thrilling light. "I'll make it worth your while." Before she could protest, he took her hand, his grip warm and firm. He turned to face his stunned mother and the approaching heiress, pulling Emily gently to his side. "Mother," he said, his voice smooth as silk, and projecting just enough for those nearby to hear. "I'd like you to finally meet my wife, Emily. We were hoping to keep it a secret a little longer, but I suppose there's no time like the present." A collective gasp rippled through the immediate vicinity. The arrogant man who had insulted her stared, his mouth agape. Henry's mother looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Henry smiled, a dazzling, charming smile that was pure performance. He brought Emily's hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Darling," he said, his voice a low caress. "I believe they're playing our song." For the rest of the night, they were a whirlwind of convincing fiction. He never left her side, his hand always resting on the small of her back, a gesture of possessive intimacy that sent shivers down her spine. He whispered witty observations in her ear that made her laugh, a real, genuine laugh that surprised them both. They danced, and in his arms she felt a sense of safety and belonging that was utterly intoxicating. The chemistry between them was a palpable electric current, confusing and thrilling them in equal measure. At the end of the night, he escorted her to the hotel's grand entrance, away from the prying eyes. The fantasy was over. "You were Convincing, he said, his voice back to its cool, professional tone, though his eyes still held a flicker of the night's warmth. "You're not a bad actor yourself, Doctor," she replied, her heart still pounding. He reached into his jacket and handed her a slim black business card. "I'll be in touch," he said. And with that, he turned and disappeared into a waiting black car, leaving her standing on the curb, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heat that still lingered on her skin where he had touched her. She looked down at the card in her hand, her mind spinning. What in the world had just happened? Hey, before we move on to the next chapter, I want to send a special shout-out to our amazing listeners who are always here on the channel: Elizabeth from South Africa, Carolyn from the Pacific Northwest, and Marion from London. Thank you for always being so active here. And what about you? Where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments, and maybe in the next story, your name will be featured too. Let's continue. The week after the wedding was a return to the harsh, gray reality of Emily's life. The memory of the glittering ballroom, of Henry's hand on her back, felt like a fever dream. She worked double shifts at the diner, the scent of grease and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the memory of champagne and his expensive cologne. Her mother had a bad turn, and a new, terrifying pile of medical bills had arrived, each one a paper and ink monster threatening to devour what little they had left. She was in the middle of a lunch rush, balancing a tray of plates, when the diner fell silent. It was the same phenomenon she had witnessed at the wedding, the sudden collective hush that announced his arrival. Dr. Henry Montgomery stood in the doorway, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that made him look like a king who had wandered into a peasant's hovel. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing the starstruck patrons, and landed directly on her. He walked to the counter, his presence so powerful it seemed to bend the air around him. "Miss Scott," he said, his voice a low, calm command that cut through the diner's clatter. "I believe we have some business to discuss." He waited while she handed off her tray to a wide-eyed co-worker, then led her to a quiet corner booth. He didn't waste a moment on small talk. "I've taken the liberty of looking into your situation," he began, his tone crisp and clinical. It was a chillingly casual admission of the depth of his resources. "Your mother's congestive heart failure, the mounting debt from her previous hospital stays, your 2 jobs, which are still not enough to cover the cost of the medication she needs." He laid out the grim reality of her life, as if he were reading a patient's chart. Emily felt a flush of shame, of anger. He was dissecting her desperation. "I am proposing a formal arrangement," he continued, his gray eyes intense, analytical. "A 1-year contract. You will perform the duties of my wife in a public-facing capacity. You will attend corporate and social events. You will maintain the illusion we created at the wedding." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land. "In exchange, I will settle every one of your family's debts. Immediately. Furthermore, your mother will be transferred to a private room at Montgomery General. She will be under the care of the best cardiac team in the country. Every test, every procedure, every medication, all of it will be covered. She will want for nothing." It was a miracle, a lifeline thrown into the churning, dark waters that were about to pull her under. It was everything she had been praying for, but she knew, with a sickening certainty, that there was a catch. A man like Henry Montgomery did nothing without a reason, without a safeguard. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" "You are pragmatic," he stated simply. "You are intelligent, poised under pressure, and you have a clear, powerful motivation to see this contract through to its conclusion. You are a predictable variable in an otherwise chaotic world." He leaned forward slightly. "And because my last marriage taught me a valuable lesson, love is a liability. Emotions are a variable I will not entertain again." He slid a sleek, impossibly thin tablet across the table. "The contract is all there." Her hands trembled as she took it. She scrolled through the dense legal text, the non-disclosure agreements, the public appearance schedules, and then she saw it. Article 11. The heading was stark and chilling. Emotional Attachment Termination Clause. She read it, her blood running cold. The clause stipulated, in clear, unambiguous legal terms, that the contract was contingent on the relationship remaining a purely transactional performance. If either party were to develop genuine romantic feelings or emotional attachment for the other, they were contractually obligated to confess these feelings immediately. Upon such a confession, the contract would be instantly terminated. All future financial benefits, including the ongoing medical care, would cease. It was a trap, a beautifully engineered, diabolical trap. He had created a game where the only way to win was to lie, but he, a man who hated lies, had made honesty a condition. If she fell for him and was honest, she would lose everything. If she fell for him and lied, she would become the one thing he despised. "This is impossible," she breathed, looking up at him, her heart pounding. "It's a punishment for having a heart." "It's a safeguard," he corrected, his voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "I do not deal in emotional variables, Miss Scott. This is a business arrangement. My terms are absolute." She looked at his face, a mask of cool, detached control. Then she thought of her mother, of her tired, worried face, of the mounting bills that kept her awake at night. She had no choice. She was trapped between a rock and a hard place, and the rock was a mountain of debt, and the hard place was this impossible, heartless man. With a trembling finger, she pressed the digital signature line on the tablet. Her name appeared in a crisp electronic script. The word "accepted" glowed on the screen. She felt a profound, soul-deep chill. She had just agreed to the terms of the most dangerous game of her life, a game where the price of falling in love was ruin. The move to Henry's penthouse was a surreal, out-of-body experience. One day, Emily was living in a cramped apartment that smelled of her mother's herbal tea. The next, she was inhabiting a silent, minimalist fortress of glass and steel that floated above the city like a modern-day Olympus. Henry greeted her not at the door, but in the cavernous living room, his posture as severe and unyielding as the architecture around him. "Welcome, Miss Scott," he said, his tone devoid of any actual welcome. "Your quarters are in the East Wing. I will show you." He led her down a long white corridor to a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire old apartment. They were beautiful, luxurious, and completely impersonal. "My own suite is in the West Wing," he stated, pausing at her doorway. "A clear physical distance helps maintain emotional clarity. Remember the clause." The reminder was a slap, a cold splash of water to ensure she never forgot the rules of their arrangement. Her first official duty as Mrs. Montgomery was a fundraising dinner for the hospital, held just 2 nights later. The transformation was dizzying. A team of stylists, summoned by Henry, descended upon her, armed with designer gowns, diamond jewelry, and makeup kits. They sculpted her into a new person, a creature of high society she didn't recognize in the mirror. When she emerged, Henry was waiting. He was dressed in a flawless tuxedo, looking impossibly handsome. He looked her up and down, his gray eyes conducting a clinical head-to-toe assessment. "Acceptable," he said, the single word of approval delivered with the emotional warmth of a lab report. But as he escorted her to the car, his hand resting on the small of her back, she felt a subtle tremor in his fingers. The contact, meant for the benefit of his driver, was a jolt of electricity that betrayed his cool facade. At the event, he was a master performer. He was the devoted, charming husband, his hand always possessively on her, his smile dazzling. He would lean in to whisper a witty observation in her ear, his breath warm against her skin, making her shiver. He would touch her arm, her shoulder, her hand, each touch a perfectly executed part of the act, yet each one sending a confusing, thrilling jolt through her. Their performance was flawless, so convincing that even they seemed to get lost in it. The most difficult moment came when his mother approached, her eyes sharp and critical. "Well, Henry," she said, her gaze raking over Emily, You certainly are full of surprises. Emily is the best surprise of my life, Henry replied smoothly, pulling Emily closer and pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her cheek. The gesture was for his mother's benefit, a public display of affection. But his lips were warm, his touch gentle, and for a fraction of a second, Emily's eyes fluttered shut. She felt something, a genuine, undeniable spark, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he had felt it too. The ride back to the penthouse was thick with a new, unspoken tension. The air crackled with the ghost of that near-intimate moment. They stood in the silent living room, the city lights glittering below them. "You performed well tonight," Henry said, his voice strained. He wouldn't look at her. "You too," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. A heavy silence fell between them. They were both thinking the same thing. The kiss on the cheek, the way she had leaned into his touch, the look in his eyes when he had pulled away. It had felt too real. He cleared his throat, taking a step back, physically re-establishing the distance between them. "Good night, Emily," he said abruptly, his voice once again cool and formal. He turned and retreated to the safety of his wing of the penthouse. "Good night, Henry," she whispered to the empty room. The denial had begun. They had both felt the first dangerous spark of genuine emotion. And they both knew, with a cold, terrifying clarity, that admitting it, even to themselves, would mean the end of the arrangement they both so desperately needed. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. The stress of her new double life, the constant performance, the gnawing anxiety of upholding the contract, the emotional whiplash of Henry's hot and cold behavior, began to take its toll. A week after the dinner, Emily woke up with a scratchy throat and a dull headache. She dismissed it as exhaustion, popping a couple of painkillers and plastering a bright smile on her face. She had a full day of duties, including accompanying Henry to a luncheon with the hospital's board of trustees. She couldn't afford to show any weakness. By midday, however, the headache was a pounding drum behind her eyes, and a feverish chill had begun to creep into her bones. She felt dizzy and weak, but she pushed through, her pride refusing to let her falter. They were standing in the pre-luncheon reception when it happened. She was listening to the chairman drone on about hospital expansion plans when the room suddenly tilted, the edges of her vision going dark. She swayed on her feet, reaching out a hand to steady herself against a nearby table. Henry, who had been deep in conversation across the room, saw it instantly. His head snapped up, his clinical gaze zeroing in on her with laser-like focus. He saw her pale face, the slight tremor in her hand, the sheen of sweat on her brow. In a move that stunned the entire room, he abruptly cut off the person he was speaking to, strode across the reception hall, and took her by the arm. "Excuse us," he announced to the bewildered chairman, his voice a low, firm command. "My wife is not feeling well. We're leaving." He didn't wait for a response. He guided her out of the room, his hand a firm, supportive presence on her back, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed them. "I'm fine," she protested weakly in the elevator. "I just felt a little dizzy." "You're not fine," he countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. He placed the back of his hand against her forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You have a fever. You're going home, and you're going to bed." It was an order, delivered with the full force of his authority as both her contractual husband and a doctor. Back at the penthouse, he didn't just send her to her room. He followed her, his concern palpable. "Get into bed," he instructed. "I'll be right back." He returned a few minutes later with a thermometer, medication, and a glass of water. He took her temperature with a practiced efficiency, his expression grim as he read the result. 102. It's a flu, he diagnosed. "You've been running yourself ragged." For the rest of the day, he became her reluctant, hyper-efficient nurse. He canceled all of his afternoon surgeries, a move she knew was practically unheard of. He brought her soup, which he had apparently bullied his private chef into making from scratch. He made sure she was hydrated, that she took her medication on schedule. He was brusque, his bedside manner clinical, but his actions spoke louder than his words. His worry was a tangible thing in the room. That night, the fever spiked. She drifted in and out of a restless, feverish sleep, plagued by disjointed dreams. At one point, she felt a cool hand on her forehead and whimpered, half asleep. "Shh, it's all right," a low voice murmured from the darkness. "Just the fever." She cracked her eyes open to see Henry sitting in the chair beside her bed, a dim lamp casting long shadows across his face. He was watching her, his expression unguarded in the darkness. "You're still here," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "I'm here," he confirmed softly. He reached out to check her temperature again, his hand cool and steady on her hot skin. As his hand rested on her forehead, his thumb, in a slow, unconscious gesture, stroked her temple. It was a simple, soothing motion, a gesture of pure, unthinking tenderness. It was not the action of a doctor with a patient, or a man fulfilling a contract. It was an act of genuine care. He seemed to realize what he was doing at the same moment she did. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned, a look of shock and self-reproach flashing across his face. He stared at his own hand, then at her, his jaw tight with a sudden, fierce irritation, an irritation directed entirely at himself. He had broken his own cardinal rule. He had allowed an emotional variable to enter the equation. Without another word, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving her alone in the darkness, her skin still tingling from the ghost of his touch. He was terrified, she realized, not of her or of the flu, but of the undeniable, terrifying truth that his own heart was betraying him. After Emily recovered from the flu, a new, fragile tension settled between them. Henry's act of care and his subsequent panicked retreat had been a silent confession. They both knew he had felt something, and they both knew they couldn't talk about it. They tiptoed around each other, their conversations painfully polite, their interactions meticulously professional, each of them desperately trying to reinforce the crumbling walls of their contract. The universe, however, seemed to have other plans. "We have to go to Florence," Henry announced one evening, his tone brusque, his eyes fixed on a file he was reading. "Florence?" Emily asked, surprised. "There's a neurosymposium at the Careggi University Hospital," he explained, still not looking at her. "I'm the keynote speaker. As my devoted wife, your presence is expected. We leave Friday." The thought of being trapped with him for 3 days in the most romantic city in the world was both terrifying and exhilarating. Florence was a dream, but for Emily and Henry, it was a beautiful, sun-drenched torture chamber. To maintain their public image, they were forced into a constant performative intimacy that felt dangerously real. They had to share a suite, with separate bedrooms, of course, but a shared living space. They had to walk arm in arm through the cobblestone streets, posing for pictures for the hospital's social media team, who were documenting the trip. On their first afternoon, they were instructed to get some romantic shots for the hospital's newsletter. They found themselves standing on the Ponte Vecchio, a professional photographer directing them. "Closer," the photographer called out. "Dr. Montgomery, put your arm around her." "Mrs. Montgomery, laugh. Look at him like you adore him." Henry's arm felt like a brand around her waist. Emily forced a laugh, tilting her head back to look at him, and was startled by the look in his eyes. He was looking down at her not with the cool detachment of a business partner, but with a raw, unguarded intensity that made her breath catch. "Perfect," the photographer shouted. Later they bought gelato and sat on the steps of a piazza, the warm Italian sun on their faces. For a moment they forgot they were performing. They talked, really talked, about the art, the history, the beauty of the city. He told her about a summer he had spent here as a medical student, and she told him about her dream of one day sketching the Duomo. They laughed at a joke he made, a real shared laugh that echoed in the sunlit square. It was easy. It was natural. It was terrifying. The breaking point came on their last night. After the symposium's formal dinner, they decided to walk back to the hotel, the air warm and scented with jasmine. They wandered through the quiet, winding streets, their footsteps echoing on the ancient stones. They stumbled upon a small hidden piazza where a lone violinist was playing a hauntingly beautiful romantic melody. A few other couples were scattered around, listening, wrapped up in each other. Henry and Emily stopped, drawn in by the music. They stood there in the soft glow of the gas lamps, not speaking, just listening. The music swelled, a melody of longing and love, and it seemed to fill the space between them, saying everything they couldn't. In the middle of the small crowd, under the Tuscan moon, he turned to look at her. The world around them seemed to melt away. There were no cameras, no colleagues, no contract. There was only the music, the moonlight, and the undeniable truth in his eyes. He saw her. Not Miss Scott, his contractual wife, not the woman from the diner. He saw Emily, and she saw him. Not the billionaire surgeon, but Henry, the man who had cared for her when she was sick, the man who had laughed with her over gelato. Slowly, inevitably, he began to lean in. The desire in his eyes was a clear, unambiguous confession. His lips were inches from hers. This was it. The moment the storm had interrupted. The moment they had both been dreading and secretly craving. The kiss that would end everything. And then, at the exact same instant, they both flinched back as if they had been electrocuted. Panic flashed in their eyes. The shared, terrifying realization of what they had almost done. They had almost broken the contract. They had almost chosen a moment of truth over a year of security. "It's getting late," he said, his voice strained, a harsh rasp in the quiet piazza. "Yes." "We should go," she replied, her own voice a breathless whisper. They turned and walked back to the hotel in a suffocating, frantic silence, a full foot of space between them. Each was trapped in their own private terror, horrified not by the man-made rules of their contract, but by the undeniable, uncontrollable laws of their own hearts. Are you enjoying this story? Don't forget to hit subscribe and help us grow. Thank you for being here. The flight back from Florence was a study in silent, agonizing tension. Henry and Emily sat side by side, a chasm of unspoken words between them. The near kiss in the piazza had shattered their fragile truce. The denial was no longer possible. They both knew the truth, and the knowledge was a dangerous, volatile substance that threatened to explode at any moment. They returned to the penthouse and to their respective wings, the physical distance a welcome, if inadequate, shield. They avoided each other for 2 days, communicating only through terse professional text messages. The explosion came not from within, but from the outside world. On the 3rd day, Emily was scrolling through a news feed on her tablet when a headline made her blood run cold. "The Ice King's Meltdown, My Life with Dr. Heartless," by Catherine Sterling. It was an exclusive excerpt from the tell-all memoir of Henry's ex-wife. With a trembling hand, Emily clicked the link. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. Catherine painted Henry not just as a neglectful husband, but as a cold, unfeeling monster. She twisted his dedication to his work into a pathological obsession, his need for privacy into a sinister secrecy, his quiet nature into a cruel, emotional withholding. She detailed fabricated arguments, twisted private moments into public grievances, and portrayed herself as the loving, long-suffering victim of a man incapable of human emotion. The article was a viral sensation. The comments section was a cesspool of vitriol directed at Henry. Sociopath, narcissist. He saves lives but destroys them at home. Emily felt a white-hot rage build in her chest. It was a lie. All of it. The man she described was a caricature, a villain from a cheap novel. He was not the man who had laughed with her in Florence, or the man who had gently placed a cool cloth on her forehead in the middle of the night. She found Henry in his study. The room was dark, save for the glow of the city lights outside the massive window. He was standing by the bar, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter, a glass in his hand. He was staring out into the darkness, his posture rigid with a pain that was almost a physical presence in the room. "Henry," she said softly from the doorway. He didn't turn. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Go to your room." "I read the article," she said, ignoring his command and walking further into the room. "It's all lies." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Is it? A cold, unfeeling man who uses contracts to manage his relationships. Sounds about right, doesn't it?" "No," she said, her voice firm. She walked over to him and gently took the whiskey glass from his hand, placing it on the counter. "She doesn't deserve your pain, Henry. She's not worth it." He finally turned to look at her, and the raw, unguarded agony in his eyes made her heart ache. The carefully constructed walls of the billionaire surgeon had crumbled, leaving only a man who was deeply, profoundly wounded. "And what do you know about it?" he asked, his voice thick with bitterness and self-loathing. "What do you know about what I deserve?" "I know," she said, her voice softening, her gaze holding his, "that the man she describes in that article is not the man who took care of me when I was sick. He's not the man who made me laugh in a piazza in Florence. He's not the man I see right now." Her fierce, unexpected loyalty, her unwavering defense of him in the face of his own self-doubt, was the one thing he was not prepared for. It broke through the last of his defenses. The pain, the humiliation, the loneliness, it all coalesced into a single, desperate, overwhelming need. With a low groan that came from the depths of his soul, he pulled her to him. His hands tangled in her hair, his mouth crashing down on hers. It was not a kiss of tenderness or of seduction. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of a drowning man clinging to his only lifeline. It was raw, hungry, and utterly consuming, a desperate attempt to blot out the pain of the past with the undeniable, breathtaking reality of the present. Emily met his desperation with her own, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body melting against his. This was it, the truth, the inevitable, catastrophic, beautiful truth. The kiss finally ended. They pulled apart, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. They stared into each other's eyes, the air crackling with the aftershock of what they had just done. The horror of their action dawned on them both at the same moment. They had just, in the most undeniable way possible, broken the contract. It was over. The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by their ragged breathing. The kiss had been a confession, an admission of everything they had been fighting so desperately to deny. The game was over. The rules had been broken. Henry was the first to pull away, stumbling back as if he had been physically struck. He stared at her, his face a mask of horror and self-loathing. He looked at his own hands as if they had betrayed him. "I kissed you," he said, his voice hollow, devoid of all emotion. He was a doctor diagnosing a fatal wound. "I felt attachment." He walked over to his desk, his movements stiff, robotic. He was no longer the passionate, desperate man who had kissed her. He was Dr. Henry Montgomery, the man of logic, the man of rules. And he was about to enforce the most painful rule he had ever written. "According to Article 11 of our agreement," he recited, the words sounding like a death sentence, "the contract is now terminated." He sat down in his chair, his back ramrod straight, and began typing on his computer. He was preparing the final fund transfer, the severance papers. He was following his own protocol, even as it was clearly destroying him. He was amputating the limb to save the body, cutting her out of his life to preserve the cold, empty order he had built around himself. Emily watched him, her heart shattering into a million pieces. He was going to do it. He was actually going to let her go, to push her away, all because of a stupid, impossible clause he had created to protect a heart that was already, clearly, broken. A fire, born of love and a fierce, desperate anger, ignited in her soul. She would not let him do this. She would not let him hide behind his own walls. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He didn't look up from his screen. "The terms are clear, Emily. I broke the clause. The consequences are automatic." "Then you're a fool," she shot back, walking to his desk and standing before him, forcing him to look at her. He finally raised his eyes, and the pain in them was so profound it stole her breath. "If we're going to be honest," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "If we're going to invoke the one clause that demands the truth, then let's be completely honest." She took a deep, steadying breath. "You weren't the only one who broke the contract, Henry," she confessed, her gaze unwavering. "I broke it too, weeks ago, maybe even the first night at the wedding. I fell in love with you. I am in love with you." Her confession hung in the air, a stunning, beautiful countermove. He stared at her, utterly speechless. He had prepared for every contingency, every variable, except this one. The impossible clause had created an impossible impasse. He had broken the rule, so he was obligated to end the contract. But she had broken it too. If they were both in breach, who had the right to enforce the penalty? The very rule that was designed to keep them apart now bound them together in their shared mutual guilt. "So what now, Henry?" she asked softly, a challenge in her eyes. "You can't fire me for breaking a rule you broke yourself. You can't enforce a penalty on me that you also deserve. Your perfect, logical, emotion-proof contract, it has a loophole." He looked from her defiant, loving face to the termination papers on his screen. His entire world, a world built on rules and control, had just been turned upside down by the one variable he had refused to entertain. He was a genius, a master of logic. But in that moment, faced with the beautiful, illogical, and undeniable truth of their shared love, he had absolutely no idea what to do. The mutual confession left them in an impossible suspended state. The contract was broken, yet it couldn't be enforced. They were bound by the very rule that should have torn them apart. The air in the penthouse, once charged with unspoken tension, was now thick with an agonizing spoken truth they had no idea how to navigate. They spent the next 2 days as ghosts in the magnificent apartment, avoiding each other, lost in their own confused thoughts. The foundation of their relationship, the contract, was gone, and they were free-falling without a net. Finally, it was Emily who broke the silence. She found Henry in his study, staring out the window, looking just as lost as she felt. "I have to go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I can't stay here like this, Henry. Not in this limbo. The contract is broken. The reason I'm here is gone. I need to think. I need space." He turned to face her, his expression etched with a pain that mirrored her own. He wanted to argue, to tell her to stay, but he had no right. He was the one who had written the rules. "I understand," he said, his voice rough. Leaving the penthouse felt like tearing a part of herself away. She returned to her old, modest apartment, which her mother had been keeping up. The debts were gone, her mother's health was secure, the practical reasons for the contract were fulfilled. But her life, which should have felt free and unburdened, now felt empty, colorless. The silence in her small apartment was a hollow ache, a stark contrast to the charged, meaningful silence she had shared with Henry. Henry, meanwhile, was adrift in his own cold, empty fortress. The penthouse, once his sanctuary of order and control, was now a monument to his failure. Her absence was a physical presence, a void in every room. He would walk past her door and feel a pang of loss so sharp it was like a physical blow. He had built a world to protect himself from emotion, and now he was drowning in it. He had lost. He had tried to control love, and love had shattered his perfect, logical world. A week after Emily left, his mother Eleanor arrived at the penthouse for their scheduled weekly dinner. She found him in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at a blank wall. The house was immaculate, but it felt dead. "Good heavens, Henry," she said, her sharp eyes taking in his disheveled appearance, the emptiness in his eyes. "You look dreadful. Where is that girl, the Scott girl?" "She's gone," Henry said, his voice flat, Gone? What do you mean, gone? I was just beginning to like her. She had a spine. Unlike that insipid textile heiress, Eleanor sniffed, her disapproval of his previous potential matches still potent. What did you do? Henry, for the first time in his life, told his mother the complete truth. He told her about the contract, the impossible clause, the kiss, the mutual confession, and Emily's departure. Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. He expected a lecture, a told-you-so about the folly of getting involved with someone from a different world. Instead, she let out an exasperated sigh. You, my son, she said, her voice surprisingly gentle, are a brilliant, brilliant idiot. She stood up and walked over to him. You create a ridiculous, self-sabotaging rule to protect yourself from getting hurt, and when you finally find a woman with the strength and character to actually break through it, you let her walk away because of it? Of all the foolish, illogical things you have ever done, this is by far the most stupid. Henry stared at her, stunned. His mother, the formidable matriarch who had orchestrated his social life with an iron fist, the woman who had pushed him toward appropriate matches, was taking Emily's side. She patted his cheek, a rare gesture of affection. I don't know what ridiculous agreement you two had, but I know what I saw. That girl looks at you like you hung the moon, and you, my son, haven't looked this alive, this human, since before your father died. Now stop moping and go fix the mess you made. With that, she turned and left him alone in the study. Her words, the most unexpected blessing, the most surprising validation, were like a key turning in a lock he didn't even know was there. A few minutes later, Eleanor, from the privacy of her car, made a phone call. Emily, my dear, she said, her voice warm and conspiratorial. It's Eleanor Montgomery. I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm calling because my son is being an idiot, and I believe you are the only one who can fix him. Eleanor's phone call left Emily stunned. The woman she had viewed as a formidable, judgmental obstacle had just become her most unlikely ally. The conversation was brief, but Eleanor's message was clear. My son is miserable without you. Go get him. But Emily knew it wasn't her move to make. She had confessed her feelings. She had shown him her heart. The next step, if there was to be one, had to come from him. He had to be the one to choose to break his own rules, to step out of his fortress of logic and into the messy, unpredictable world of real emotion. Meanwhile, Henry was a man unmoored. His mother's words had stripped away his last defense, the cold, hard logic of the contract. He had followed his own rules to the letter, and they had led him to this empty, silent hell. He had won the battle for control, but had lost the war for happiness. He thought about Emily. He thought about her fierce loyalty when his ex-wife's book was released. He thought about her laughter in Florence. He thought about the look in her eyes when she had confessed her love for him, a look of such raw, terrifying honesty. He realized that his entire life had been about mitigating risk, controlling variables, protecting himself. But the greatest risk, he now understood, was not in loving and getting hurt. The greatest risk was in never loving at all. He couldn't stand the silence of the penthouse for another second. He grabbed his car keys and drove, with no destination in mind. He found himself an hour later, parked across the street from the small, unassuming diner where he had first presented her with the contract. He watched the waitresses bustling inside, the steam fogging up the windows. It felt like a lifetime ago. He saw her. She was sitting alone at a small table by the window, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands, staring out at the street with a sad, distant look in her eyes. She looked beautiful and fragile and completely out of his reach. For a long moment, he just sat there, his heart pounding. He was terrified. He, Dr. Henry Montgomery, who could hold a human brain in his hands without a tremor, was terrified of walking across the street and speaking to a waitress. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the car. He walked into the diner, the bell above the door chiming, announcing his arrival just as it had before. She looked up, and her eyes widened in surprise. He walked to her table and sat down in the chair opposite her. He didn't speak, just looked at her, taking in the sight of her, memorizing the curve of her lips, the intelligence in her eyes. "You were right," he said finally, his voice raw and quiet. "I was a fool. I built a fortress of ice around myself to protect me from a pain that happened years ago, and I didn't even realize I was freezing to death inside it." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers, not daring to touch her without permission. "And then you came along. You didn't try to break down the walls. You just brought so much warmth and light that you melted them from the inside out. I'm terrified, Emily. I'm terrified of feeling this much for someone. But I've learned in the last week that I'm much more terrified of the thought of living the rest of my life without you." He slid a document across the table. It wasn't a contract. It was a single, first-class, open-ended plane ticket. To anywhere in the world. "You are free, Emily," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Truly free. The trust for your mother's care is irrevocable. It's secured for her lifetime no matter what. You don't owe me anything. You can take this ticket and you can go anywhere, be anyone, build any life you want. And I will never bother you again." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "But I hope," he whispered, his voice breaking, "that you choose to stay. I hope you choose me." He stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. He didn't wait for her answer. He couldn't. He had laid his heart, his hope, and his vulnerability on the table. He had given her the ultimate choice, with no strings, no clauses, no conditions. He turned and walked out of the diner, leaving her alone with the ticket to anywhere, and the unspoken question of whether her world was still with him. Emily sat in the quiet diner, the murmur of conversations and the clinking of cutlery fading into a distant hum. The only thing that felt real was the plane ticket resting on the table in front of her. It was a slip of paper that represented absolute freedom. Paris, Rome, Tokyo, a new life, a blank page, a chance to be the artist she had always dreamed of being, with no debts, no worries, no attachments. It was everything she should have wanted. But as she looked at it, she didn't feel a thrill of excitement. She felt a profound, hollow ache. A world without Henry in it, no matter how beautiful or exotic, felt like a world in black and white. He was the color. He was the warmth. He was the chaotic, terrifying, beautiful variable that made her feel alive. She thought of his face when he had made his plea. The raw vulnerability, the fear, the hope. He had given her the ultimate gift, a choice with no strings attached. He had finally, truly trusted her. She didn't need to think. Her heart had already made its decision weeks ago. She left the ticket on the table, a silent offering to a life she no longer wanted, and walked out of the diner. Henry was in his study, pacing like a caged animal. He had been staring at his phone for an hour, waiting, hoping, dreading. He had played his final card, and now he had no moves left. He was completely, utterly powerless. He heard the soft chime of his private elevator arriving at the penthouse floor. His heart stopped. He stood frozen, barely breathing, listening to the soft footsteps approaching his office. The door opened. It was Emily. She stood in the doorway, her expression calm and certain. She didn't say a word. She walked to his desk, where a framed photo of his parents sat. She picked it up, then walked to the bar where the open plane ticket lay. She placed the ticket on the bar, then walked to the large abstract painting on the wall. "What are you doing?" he finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I'm redecorating," she said simply. She walked back to him, stopping just a few feet away. "I don't want a ticket to the world, Henry," she said, her voice soft but ringing with a strength that filled the vast room. "I already have my world." She took a step closer. "It's here. With you." The relief that washed over his face was so profound, it was like watching a statue come to life. He crossed the space between them in a single stride, his hands coming up to frame her face as if to be sure she was real. "I thought I'd lost you," he breathed, his forehead resting against hers. "Never," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, relieved beating of his heart. "You just had to come and find me." He pulled her into a hug, a desperate, all-encompassing embrace that was not about passion, but about homecoming. It was the first time they had held each other without the shadow of the contract, without rules, without fear. It was just them. "I love you, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion, muffled by her hair. "I love you, Henry," she replied, her voice full of a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. They had found their way back to each other, not by following the rules, but by having the courage to break them. Hey dear, are you enjoying this story? Don't forget to hit subscribe and help us grow. Thank you for being here. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Living together without the suffocating weight of the contract, they discovered the simple, beautiful rhythm of being a real couple. They learned each other's habits, the way he always left his coffee cup on the edge of the counter, the way she hummed softly when she was sketching. They had late-night conversations that had nothing to do with public appearances and everything to do with their hopes, their fears, and their shared future. Henry, for his part, was a man transformed. The cold, clinical surgeon was replaced by a warm, attentive partner. He would come home from the hospital, and the first thing he would do was find her, his smile genuine, his eyes full of a love he no longer tried to hide. He took a genuine interest in her art, converting one of the penthouse's spare rooms into a beautiful, light-filled studio for her, without her even having to ask. One evening, about a month after she had returned, he came home with a mysterious smile on his face. "Put on something nice," he said, his eyes sparkling with a secret. "We have a reservation." "A reservation where?" she asked, intrigued. "You'll see," was all he would say. He took her back to the opulent plaza, the hotel where their strange, complicated story had begun. But he didn't lead her to the grand ballroom. Instead, he led her up a private elevator to a stunning rooftop terrace that had been closed to the public for the night. The terrace was empty, save for a single table set for two, surrounded by hundreds of flickering candles. In the corner, a lone cellist was playing the same soft, classical music that had been playing the night of the wedding. "Henry, what is all this?" Emily breathed, completely overwhelmed. "This is where we had our first pretend moment," he said, taking her hands in his. "I wanted our first real one to be here too." He looked at her, his gray eyes, once so cold and analytical, now filled with a warmth and a love so profound it made her heart ache. "Our contract is over, Emily," he began, his voice low and serious. "But I find myself wanting to propose a new one, a permanent one." He slowly got down on one knee. The billionaire neurosurgeon, the man who commanded boardrooms and operating theaters, was kneeling before her under the stars. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple, elegant diamond ring that glittered in the candlelight. It wasn't a flashy, ostentatious stone. It was tasteful, timeless, and perfect. "Emily Scott," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to conceal. "You came into my life as a variable I couldn't control, and you became the only thing I can't live without. You taught me that a life without risk is a life without joy, and a heart without love is just an organ. Our first agreement had an impossible clause. I want to make you a new one, with no clauses, no conditions, no end date." He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "Will you marry me, Emily? For real this time?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down her face. She was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Yes, of course, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. He stood up, pulling her into his arms and kissing her, a deep, loving kiss that held the promise of a lifetime. It was a kiss that sealed their new and final agreement. 1 year later, Emily stood in that same sun-dappled garden where she had once felt like an outsider. But this time, she was the bride, and the joy was real. Their wedding was an intimate, beautiful affair, attended only by their closest friends and family. Emily's mother, her face glowing with health and happiness, sat in the front row, weeping openly. Eleanor Montgomery sat beside her, patting her hand in a gesture of shared motherly pride, a rare, genuine smile on her own face. As Emily walked down the aisle, she only had eyes for Henry. He stood waiting for her, not with the cool, detached air of a man playing a part, but with an open, adoring expression that was meant only for her. The love in his eyes was a tangible force, a warm, brilliant light. Their vows were simple, heartfelt, and deeply personal, filled with inside jokes and promises that held the weight of their unique journey. Later, at the reception, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the happy guests, Henry pulled her away for a quiet moment. They stood by the same fountain where they had first seen each other across a crowded room. "I have something for you," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. He reached into the pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a cocktail napkin from the hotel bar. "Our final contract," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it. On it, he had written a single sentence in his sharp, decisive handwriting. The final clause, Party A, Henry, and Party B, Emily, hereby agree to break the emotional attachment termination clause, joyfully and with extreme prejudice every single day for the rest of their lives. Below it were 2 lines for signatures. Emily laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed in the twilight. "This is the best contract you've ever written," she said. He produced a pen from his pocket. "Shall we make it official?" They leaned against the fountain, using the cool marble as a makeshift desk, and signed their names on the napkin. He took it from her, folded it carefully, and placed it back in his pocket, close to his heart. "Binding for a lifetime," he said, his voice full of a love so deep it was bottomless. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss that held all the promises of their future. Their story had started with a lie whispered in a crowded room, a game of pretend with impossible rules. But it had ended here, with a truth written on a napkin, a testament to the beautiful, undeniable fact that the best rules are the ones that are broken by love. And that's the end of today's story, my dear. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment telling me what you thought, and share it with a friend. Thank you for keeping me company. See you in the next story.